Hi everyone, welcome to another exciting edition of Words, Images, and Worlds. I spent 8 years as a middle school teacher, and so I'm always eager to talk with folks who write and explore that area of life as well as the years leading up to it, the years after it. And in this case, I am glad to be talking with author Chad Lucas. Chad, thank you for joining.
It's my pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Absolutely, my pleasure. I almost always start by mentioning a couple of titles. And forgive me, it's been a little bit of a long day, but I'm going to mention a couple here that I've written down to make sure that I get this right. Let the Monster Out being one of those. You have a two-book series, Thanks a Lot Universe, You Owe Me One Universe. And then you also have a book coming in 2025 called Vanished Ones.
The
So a
Vanished Ones,
nice
yes.
collection of work out there.
hmm Yeah, it's been a fun journey over the last few years.
Yeah, yeah. That's what I keep telling my students. I keep telling my students writing is fun. I don't know that all of them believe me, but totally. So what connected you to the written word? How did you decide that this was what you wanted to do in terms of writing and creating?
Yeah, I mean, I was a kid who read all the time, read everything I could get my hands on. I mean, I know that's not the story for every author. Not every author is like a bookworm when they're a kid, but that is my story. Um, I was homeschooled for a few years, and I would spend my time just like I would go to the library and check out as many books as I was allowed on my like youth library card. I think it was like 30 at the time. And so, I just read all the time. My favorite author as a kid was Gordon Corman, who's a fellow Canadian, still going, still writing books. But I back then it was the MacDonald Hall series, Bruno and Boots. And I would check out his books over and over again. They just made me laugh. But his story, his background, as I learned more about him, he actually wrote his first book as like a seventh grade English project and had it published when he was like 14 years old. So, me being a 10, 11, I was like, well, if Gordon Corman could do that, maybe I could too. So that's kind of what inspired me to write. Again, one of the years I was homeschooled grade 6 to 8. And so sixth grade, I kind of gave myself a project of like trying to write a book. So, I started on a typewriter because I'm that old back in the days when we still used typewriters. Um, and it was kind of like a Gordon Corman knockoff story, but that inspired me to start writing and coming up with my own characters. And one of the things that I think, and not even consciously at the time, but I look back now, I like to write stories, but imagine myself in the kind of stories that I was reading because I grew up in a time when I'm of African descent, and there weren't a lot of books with black kids in them. I can't even recall the first book I would have picked up with a black kid on the cover, but it certainly wouldn't have happened when I was 10 or 11. Not that they didn't exist at all, but they certainly weren't as many as there are now. So I think part of what drew me to writing, and I would say this again, subconsciously as a kid, I wasn't consciously thinking about it at the time, but I wanted to see people who looked like me in the kind of stories that I like to read. So that also inspired me and drew me to writing.
Yeah, yeah, that's a very important part of reading and writing, and I think seeing yourself in a book is taken for granted so much by folks who are so often represented. So appreciating that very much.
Hmm.
Yeah. Uh, Curious about a time that I usually like to ask this of folks that write for younger readers because it's always interesting to interact with young people. So curious about a time that there's been kind of an exchange, an interaction that was unexpected in some way.
Yeah, we live in a time again when kids can find you online, right? Like they can look up your website, and I've got like just like a form submission on there where people can send me emails. So I occasionally will get an email from a young reader. Uh, and the ones that always really get me are, and this kind of goes back to what I was just talking about, but kids who feel seen in my books. I've had a few who've read either Thanks a Lot Universe or You Owe Me One Universe who really identify, with Ezra, who's a queer kid trying to figure out his feelings. And I've had kids write to me and say, like, you kind of helped me understand my feelings that I'm having for another kid in my class.
Mm,
And so those kind of emails always mean a lot to me because again, I wish I had seen more of myself in the books I had read at that age. So to be able to write books that have that kind of effect on a kid, that they feel seen, that they maybe understand themselves in a way that they didn't beforehand, that always means a lot to me. And of course, I also enjoy when I can actually get to meet kids in person. Like I love doing school visits and going out and being in a classroom with kids. I was on a couple earlier this week, and that's always really fun. And it's fun to see when something sparks in kids about writing too. Like
mm,
yesterday,
mm.
I was in a school and we were in the path of the eclipse here in Nova Scotia. I don't know if you got to experience the eclipse or
It,
not the other
it
day.
was very cloudy. There was something
Okay.
eclipse-like happening, but yeah.
Okay. Well, we fortunately had a sunny day, so we got to experience it. And so, my writing prompt for the kids was like, imagine during the solar eclipse, you somehow get sucked into an alternate dimension.
Nice.
And the class was ending and kids were still scribbling, and the teacher was like, okay, you have to go on to your next class now. So, for me to see a kid get that into like coming up with their own story as well, that's always really fun as an author to see that spark just come alive in another kid.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. I'm inspired to try that writing prompt out. That would be really interesting to see what my
It's
students come
yeah.
up
I
with.
like I like to come up with really kind of fun, quirky ones because those are the ones that get the imagination flowing for sure.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. And a lot of your work has this emotional core to it, which good books should always have. There are emotions that you process, there are experiences that you process. So with that in mind, I'm just thinking about how like Let the Monster Out, there are frightening things about it, but it's really about dealing with fear or
Hmm.
dealing with anxiety, depression, things like that. So curious about the kinds of stories that draw you in the one way and balancing that out with uh, kind of writing the book for a young audience as well.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean I'm certainly drawn to stories where there is a deep emotional core.
Mm,
Like I like the occasional like, just like action-packed story or whatever or things like that. But and I mean not to say that action and emotion are separate either. You can have a very action-packed emotional story. But I would say drawn more to like the emotional core of stories. It's characters and their struggles, their triumphs. That's what draws me to a story more than say the plot per se. Um,
mhm,
and I tend to resonate again with stories of kids who feel a little bit on the outside one way or the other. Again, whether it's because of their sexuality, because they're dealing with a mental health issue, because of their race. Um, in Let the Monster Out, one of the main characters is autistic or thinks he might be autistic. He doesn't actually have a diagnosis as the book starts. So, kids, yeah, who see the world a little bit differently, who maybe feel a little bit on the outside of things. Those kind of stories have always spoken to me as well. Because I think a lot of us, when we're that age, 12, 13, often do feel like a little bit alone, right? Like
mhm.
even if you're like the popular kid, in some ways you feel like nobody totally knows me and I'm figuring out who I am. And so I think that's a pretty common thing at that age. And so I'm kind of drawn to those stories and tend to write those kind of stories as well.
Yeah, yeah, and there's so much power in that too of reading books to know that you're not alone, and then
Yeah,
kind of getting to step into your imagination. I love that.
yeah.
Yeah.
And I hope at the end of the day too. I mean, I don't write to teach lessons, quote unquote, because
Mm-hmm.
kids can see that coming a mile away if you're really trying to do that. But I do hope, that a good book can help put you in someone else's shoes and maybe, think about the fact that there might be more going on with someone than you see on the surface. So, I hope my books might inspire people to think more deeply about the people in the world around them as well.
Yeah, yeah. Well, by means of a final official question, and then we can hit anything that we've missed. I mentioned Vanished Ones. coming in 2025. Anything that you'd like to mention about that project or anything else that's next for you? And then you also mentioned that readers can find you online these days. So spaces where you like to connect that way and where people can find out about school visits and that sort of thing as well.
Sure. Yeah. So The Vanished Ones, I'm really excited about it. It's quite a different book from my others. It's more fantasy-ish. It's kind of set in a made-up world. So it was a stretch for me to write because my others are all more contemporary, set in real world, most often in Nova Scotia, where I live.
Mhm.
Uh, and so this one, it was a definitely a challenge to write, but it was also a lot of fun to kind of stretch myself. So it's about a boy who's growing up in kind of a religious order on an island. He's always lived there as long as he can remember, but he's not sure exactly where he came from. Um, and on this island, he's kind of trying to do his best to be a good member of this order, but there are odd things happening on this island. Uh, every spring and fall, there's a big storm, and a kid disappears. And so one of his friends disappears. He starts asking more questions, like why does this happen, and more importantly, why does nobody do anything about it? And that leads him to kind of find out more about the islands and the way he's being raised, and learn that things maybe aren't as he was always told or taught. And he has to make some decisions about what he's going to do with that. So it's a lot about, questioning the beliefs we're sometimes given as kids, and figuring out for ourselves what we believe about the world. And so, again, kind of that deep topic, but for middle grade readers. So, I don't like to tackle anything too light. It's just the big existential questions about life. So yeah, I'm really excited about that. It comes out next January. And then I also have a short story in an anthology called Today I Am, coming out this summer. It's a series of books by Canadians of diverse backgrounds, or a series of stories, sorry, by Canadians of diverse backgrounds. And that was a really fun project to do too, to mix it up and do like a short story as opposed to a full-length novel. So that was a fun project to work on as well.
And middle grade students, they ask those big questions. So great
Yeah,
to have
exactly.
voices to go along with them. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I think, people sometimes ask that question, like, how do you make things age appropriate? And which, certainly you certainly have to consider, but kids can handle more than we sometimes give them credit for, right?
Hmm.
And they're
Hmm.
asking those questions. So I think it's important to give them books and material that challenges them to think and lets them know it's okay to ask big questions and think about big topics.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And that final piece of the question was those spaces online. You mentioned school visits. Anything you'd like to share about that?
Yeah, you can find me at chadlucaswrites.com, and I'm on Instagram, and it's kind of trying to navigate this social media space these days as things change and evolve. But I do use Instagram and trying out Blue Sky, and
Hmm. Hmm.
still on the Twitter a little bit, but less these days. But yeah, you can find me online or through my website. And I do enjoy doing school visits. I've been mostly doing them locally in my part of Canada right now, but I'm certainly always open to, virtual travel is a little more difficult
Hmm.
when you're in a place like I am, but always happy to connect with young readers however I can.
Wonderful. Anything that we've missed about writing, creating, or anything about the process that you'd like to mention before we close out?
Yeah, I guess the only other thing I'll say, and I like to say this particularly when I'm in classrooms, is, some of those first stories I talked about, were very like early Gordon Corman, like a lot of like kids getting into shenanigans and things like that. But there are nuggets of the first stories I wrote when I was 11 or 12
Hmm.
in Let the Monster Out. So, I mean, it looks very different than what I wrote when I was 11 or 12, but I just like to remind kids, those ideas that you have now, they might not pay off right now, but they could be seeds that become a book or a story or the movie that you make or something like that down the road. So,
Hmm.
don't ever discount those early creative ideas when you have as a kid, because they might pay off someday.
Absolutely. Keep those old notebooks and old files and all of those kind of things.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much, Chad. I appreciate the time. Glad to have you back anytime to talk about projects as they're coming to be. And thanks for the writing and the creating.
Thanks for having me. It was my pleasure.